Hello, I'm Will Pointer,
And I'm Ray Pointer.
and together we're the founders of ResearchWise AI. And today we're going to talk to you about synthetic data. First of all, Ray, tell us what synthetic data is and what it can mean in market research.
So it's one of those things that is always problematic to define, but I'm settling down pretty much on it's data that has been created instead of collected. So normal data is collected by talking to people in the market research industry. It might be from telemetry, it might be from passive data collection, all sorts of things. But synthetic data has been created instead of collected.
And I've been hearing a little bit about different types of synthetic data. Is there anything you can expand upon the different types of synthetic data and what people are talking about?
So, in the world of market research, there are broadly three types of synthetic data. The one that perhaps we're seeing the most is what we're calling augmented synthetic data. So, I do a survey, I collect maybe 1,000 interviews. I wanted to have 250 young men in that data set, but when I look at the data set, I've only got 150. So, I want to boost the sample up to the 250. So I create 100 synthetic cases, which are young men, which match the characteristics that I would have expected if I had collected 100 more people. So that is a really common use that we're beginning to see around the industry, augmented synthetic data. The next most common is personas. And instead of replicating individuals, so augmented synthetic data is creating additional individuals. Personas more typically tries to create data that represents groups of people. So we might have a persona for brand loyalists. We might have a persona for trialists. We might have a persona for rural occasionals or whatever it is, and try to create that information. And personas can be quantitative. Synthetic data is mostly quantitative. Augmented synthetic data is mostly quantitative. Personas can be, but more typically, they're qualitative. So brands can then have a conversation with these personas and say, if I were to do this, how might people respond? And the third category is talked about in some of the journals and it's talked about in some of the newspaper articles and the trade press, but isn't really used very much yet, which is fully synthetic data. Instead of collecting survey data from people, we absolutely just construct it from the information we already have, and then we use that in the analysis process.
Brilliant, thank you. Good, nice, thorough answer there. And so to continue that, why are we hearing so much about synthetic data? Is it all because it's new in AI, or has it got a really practical, useful application, or is it a bit of both?
It's mostly around two really attractive features. It's much faster and it's much cheaper. Um, if we could create data without doing any surveys whatsoever, instead of projects taking days, they would take minutes. You could imagine a situation where you were in a planning meeting at a client and they said, we really need to have some information on this. They could speak in natural language to the computer. The computer could run some analyses, generate some synthetic data, come back with some opinions. Now, we're not at that point yet, but if we talk about augmented synthetic data, the most expensive and the most time consuming part of the data is the last 10%, the last 20%. If that could be the synthetic part, then we speed the process up, we reduce the costs. So that is why people are super excited in this field.
And of course, we always like saving money and making things faster. But in the case of fully synthetic data and personas, is there also an argument of the what is often the number one priority of lots of market research company is data security? Is there a case that fully synthetic data can also help in that space?
Absolutely. So historically, one of the earliest uses of synthetic data was in the census. Before they released census information to the researchers, they would add noise to it to protect the anonymity of the people who had supplied that data. And we, by replacing real bank data with synthetic bank data, by replacing very sensitive questions about people, their lives, their beliefs, and their behaviors with synthetic data, you could potentially protect those people. So that is of real interest to a relatively small group of people, but an important group of people. So we could see that that would be part of the process there.
That makes a lot of sense. Just to pivot slightly on this, one area where we're seeing synthetic data used in software development is one of the biggest challenges we've often had is that we develop software to work on real people's data, but we don't want to often expose the real people's data to the entire development team, which can be hundreds of engineers who have no real reason to know about your personal data. So we have a big job creating fake data to try and test with, which is often not similar enough to the real data. And so synthetic data has started to come in as a way of composing completely fake users who are interacting with apps in fairly realistic ways to then test those apps. Uh,
So I'm
so
smiling a lot here because fake is one of those words that crops up in the debate around synthetic data in the research industry. And it's normally used by people that don't approve of synthetic data. And I draw a big distinction between fake when it's used without telling somebody this has been created, and synthetic where you tell people this data has been created. Here are the characteristics. And it's quite interesting when you look at where people come from. People who come from the arts generally have a fairly bad view of the word synthetic. So they will talk about synthetic love, synthetic art, and so on. When you get to music, however, synthetic music has got its lovers as well as its haters. Move to science, you take something like insulin. Real insulin is made from the pancreas of dead pigs and other animals and has got lots of impurities. Synthetic insulin is the good stuff. That's the one you want. Um, so it's often interesting when this word fake crops up in the discussion.
but while we're moving on to negatives, we've heard lots of the good things about synthetic data. What are some of the concerns from the industry?
Well, the biggest one is that it won't work. And that's a really big concern. And the second one is how do you know whether it's working or not? And perhaps we'll dive into that in a moment. But just because it worked last time doesn't mean it will work next time. Just because it worked when we tested toothpaste doesn't mean that it will work when we test cars. Just because it worked when we were estimating what young men would have said doesn't mean that it will work when we want to estimate young women or something like this. So everything is based on experiential information. There's no deep philosophy of why it should work, and that is concerning.
And you said the most common form of synthetic data in the industry at the moment is augmented synthetic data. So can you expand upon that?
Yeah, sure. So if we're trying to, we do a study and we don't have as many final cases as we want, and so historically we might have used weighting. So we've only got 150 men. We want young men. We wanted 250. We will upweight them. There are some problems with that. It tends to behave in a clunky way. Synthetic data holds up the possibility of that data behaving more like 250 data points would behave. They won't replicate exactly what the 250 would be, but they will behave more like a 250 than 150 upweighted. If we think about tracking studies, then we collect 1/12 of the data every month. And that will often understate changes in the real marketplace because you look at moving averages and you look at the last year's data. If something quite dramatic is happening this month, we make it harder to see with traditional methods of using information. If we can use synthetic data to amplify the most recent data, we can look at it in greater depth. So that is where we're seeing synthetic data coming into play, not having to collect the last 10%, perhaps with the hard to reach people. So we're doing that and it's pulling in there. But that is where this discussion about how do you test it comes into play.
Yes, I see that. Is it fair to say that augmented synthetic data is an improvement upon a potential improvement upon weighting to fill that gap, to simulate effectively the shortage of data is a potential improvement upon that?
I would say that's a very fair comment. It's a potential improvement. It doesn't deal with the problem entirely, and it needs to make sure that it is an improvement because it's adding an extra uncertainty. It's something that's a bit less that people can understand, whereas weighting is very straightforward. But it should be, when done correctly, in many cases, an improvement on weighting.
And you mentioned a couple of times about the importance of validating this efficacy and whether it is going in the right direction. How are people going about that problem right now?
The good players, and there are quite a few of them, have a pretty straightforward route, but it's got a flaw to it. And so they will go to a client and say, well, give me your research projects from last year. And you've got a study there with 1,200 people. Let's remove 200 of them, put them to one side, don't give them to me. I will then use your 1,000 to generate the 1,200, and we will compare the 1,200 with your original 1,200 to see how good the fit is. And people who have published studies generally show it's pretty good. However, there isn't a good definition of how similar the data will be. Are we talking about the distribution of data? We know the significance testing would be different. Is there a difference between a point estimate? Are we trying to estimate how many people are left-handed? Or are we working with scales on a 5-point agree disagree scale? So we need really a bit more precision, a bit more definition about what similar means. You've used synthetic data to recreate something you already had. How do you then say how similar? We know what it wants to end up with. Did I make the same business decision? Fundamentally, that is what it comes down to. So the statisticians will play around with validation techniques, and that's great. But at the end of the day, would I make the same business decision with the synthetic data that I would have made with the real data?
Makes me worry about a future where data sets have been augmented and then fed into another data set that's been augmented, that's fed into another data set that's been augmented, and you start to wonder how much true data is there at the bottom of the stack.
Absolutely. I mean, this is definitely one of the concerns. We talk about cannibalization, where AI is trained on AI produced products. It's a real issue with images. Evidently, 50% of the images on the internet were generated by AI. So the AI systems are now learning from their own stuff. And if we had that with synthetic data, then there would be a level of drift, is one of the things that can certainly happen within that. And if we don't keep collecting new data, then it's hard to see how synthetic data can be useful in 5 years' time or 10 years' time if there has been no new data collected through that process.
Moving on from augmented data onto personas, the more qual-friendly synthetic data. Can you tell us a bit more about personas?
Yes, absolutely. So there's some really quite interesting works, and I'll give a bit of a shout out to Signoi, who are doing quite a bit in this zone. So they will work with a client. They will have access to an LLM, but they will also upload lots and lots and lots of data from that client to it. There will be segmentation work the client has done. There will be brand tracking information, all sorts of things like that. And then they'll talk about, okay, what are the typical types of customer and what have they said in the focus groups and the transcripts? So, right, I've got that on board. Now I can have conversations between the brand manager and the advertising manager with these personas. And here, the validation process gets even harder. If I'd employed two qualitative researchers and given them this from a different background, they've never met each other, I gave them the same exercise to go and do, they would both come back with a useful, true interpretation, but it would be different. And likewise, we wouldn't expect the personas generated by one set of exercises to replicate what any specific human would have created. So now this basic test of is it useful becomes even more important. And it's probably going to be something like a new version of the Turing test, where you're trying to say, does this persona come up with the answers it should do to key questions? So if we are asking about cars, it should say that German cars are safer than cars from another category or are better built, have got better engineering. Yes, it should probably talk about better engineering. We know that those things should be in there, and the testing becomes a whole little checklist of does it say the right things to the right questions? For those of you who've seen the old Blade Runner movie, Harrison Ford has a whole set of questions which give evidence that somebody is a droid or an android. And it's probably going to be a bit like that when we try to test these personas. And remember, they only have to be useful. They don't have to be statistically correct. So that is part of this process. If what they do is they unlock the creativity of the brand manager, then there is merit in that in itself. So it's going to be quite an interesting area. I'm seeing quite a few people use personas in things like brainstorming, where there isn't a right and a wrong answer. What they want is to generate lots of new ideas, new thoughts, and then the human in the loop is going to take the ones that are going to be the winners.
Hearing you talk about personas, is there a clear distinction here between persona or synthetic data and the augmented and fully synthetic fully synthetic data? It seems that the one is creating data sets while the other is creating an interactive entity, but also is not a persona closer to fully synthetic in the way that it is the AI that's creating the responses, whereby augmented has used AI to extrapolate from responses.
Um, so personas are closer to fully synthetic than augmented synthetic. I think that is certainly true. You could use a situation where you collected 1,000 interviews, you then use additional information to enrich them. So these became real hubs with a synthetic outer to allow you to have conversations with them. Some people are creating 1,000 personas and then giving them survey questions. So at the margin, it blurs. So what I'm talking about is a generalization that augmented synthetic data adds a small amount of quantitative data to an original set. Personas, generally speaking, create entities that represent groups of people where you can have ongoing conversations with them. And fully synthetic data is normally in the context of quantitative, but it certainly embraces personas as well.
And moving on to what I suspect could be the most controversial of the three in the market research industry, fully synthetic datasets. First of all, are people now using these in what I would call in production, in market research, for real rather than experimentation?
A small number of companies and buyers are. There's been an interesting paper published a little while ago looking at talking about car brands, and coming up with stuff that replicated the real world quite well. And you can see why in that case it would. Um, but actually, most clients are still nervous about synthetic data. So very few clients are buying the fully synthetic option. And I suspect it will be a long time, which in my book is about 2 years, before we see people being more willing to go into that fully synthetic mode. And anyway, I suspect it's a blind alley.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So, what we're trying to do with fully synthetic data in particular is we say, okay, we research people, we like having survey questions, which we give to real people. They send it back, we run analysis, and then we answer the original business question. So we have a business question, we design a survey, the survey gets asked of people, the people give us answers, we then run analyses, we then combine the business question with the analyses, and we get an insight. And maybe we could use the computer to generate the people to answer the surveys. If we can do that, we can work with the business question directly to the AI, and we really don't need to replicate this mind-bogglingly tedious process of asking survey questions. I don't, once we get to the level where the AI is really on top of understanding the data about people and manipulating the data about people, I don't think we'll need to replicate the survey question statistical analysis part of what we're doing.
Yes, I can see that. That makes a lot of sense. This is a common theme we've seen in the last 2.5 years since ChatGPT 3.5 exploded onto the scene is using modern AI to replicate manual and human steps in a process that many steps could be omitted altogether or replaced. And so, yes, generating fully synthetic data sets to then go through a set of processes which are designed because of the nature of human data collection. Yes, I can see how that may be a dead end. While you're making predictions about the future, my last question is, what else would you predict about synthetic data in the near and medium future?
With synthetic data, there is a chance it will get it wrong. With any form of market research, there is a chance it will get it wrong. How much bigger is the chance? And what we are going to see, and what we've already seen, is some buyers of research are saying, I will switch my risk over and I will start doing this because it's faster, it's cheaper. And so I think some of those are going to get some real advantages moving through. And we are going to see the regulators coming along to try to make a certain set of guidances and questions that help buyers do this more safely. But over the next couple of years, I see personas growing a lot. I see augmented synthetic data growing quite a lot. The idea that you can just talk to the computer, we can already do this with LLMs. Pretend that you're a young African American living in New York, you're interested in sports, you're doing this, and it will draw on its knowledge that it's learnt, and the literature that it's read to give you a set of answers that would be massively better than Ray Pointer's knowledge of what an African American in New York would say. But by really adding in additional data collected from young African American men into that data set, plus the rest of it, it's not necessarily personas which are kind of static, but they could be made at runtime. From all the information we've got, I want you to act now as this person. Now I want you to react as a couple of retired people who've moved to Florida, and we want to talk about diet and the rest of it. And I can see that next step of personas dealing with a lot of cases where brands need ideas, information, suggestions with a reasonable probability of being right.
Sounds like a lot of potential. So that's everything that we've got on synthetic data today. Thank you for all of answering all of my questions, Ray, and thank you for everyone at home for joining us. Please join us again next week for our next episode of Talking AI.